Hi there everyone, and welcome back to the Maths Tutor webinars on exam techniques. So this week we're looking at part 3 of a 4-part webinar series. And today is all about getting started in the exam and making sure that you manage your time well in order to get the best out of the exam as you possibly can, so to maximize your grade. And this webinar, part 3, is going to be useful for Leaving Cert and Junior Cycle exam students, regardless of your grade, whether that be higher or ordinary level. So as I mentioned, this is part 3 of a 4-part series. The previous 2 webinars are available on the TheMathsTutor.ie website, and they looked at the structure of the exam, and in particular the changes for 2022. And the part 2 looked at a checklist, a pre-exam checklist, and things to remember and to be mindful of on the day of the exam. So as I mentioned previously as well, we also have our free exam technique booklet, and I'll just flash up a link to that on the screen. That's available to access for all students at TheMathsTutor.ie/booklet, and that goes into a lot more detail on exam technique also. So I suppose overall, be it the junior cycle or the Leaving Cert exam that you're sitting, the overall idea is to get off to a great start, get off to a good start in the exam, and that will give you the confidence going forward for the rest of the exam, and it will make sure that you get into the exam and go through the exam with a positive overall attitude. And I suppose we're going to help you to try and make the most of your time with a couple of time management tips as well. So, for you Leaving Cert students, we mentioned in part 1 of this webinar series that you have 10 minutes at the start to read through the paper, to jot down any notes that you might want to remember, and to choose your questions wisely. And we have factored that 10 minutes into our timing plan. So have a look through the paper, breathe, take a minute for yourself, and choose the best questions that you feel that you can answer best in the exam and that you are the most confident about, and then eliminate the others. And also to jot down any notes that you might just have fresh in your head and you want to remember. For Leaving Cert students, remember that for the Leaving Cert 2022, you have the beauty of a choice in paper 1 and paper 2. Similar to last year's 2021 paper, but again, those were changes that were brought in 2021. So in section A, which are your short questions, there are 6 questions in total, and you need to answer a total of 4 of them, and that gives you 120 marks. So each short question is worth 30 marks. In section B, which are your context and applications questions, there are 4 questions in total, each worth 50 marks. And you need to answer 2, bringing you to a total of 100 marks for section B. For your first question, so I advise starting with section A, so starting with your concepts and skills, your short questions, starting with those short questions and then moving on to section B, because your section B questions, it applies a lot of the skills and the concepts that you use in section A. So you might see a little bit of overlap, but you've gotten good practice in section A, and then in section B, you're applying those to real life problems. Some people like to start with their favorite question. So for example, if you think complex numbers is one of your strengths, it's your strong point, maybe you want to start, if a complex numbers question comes up in section A on paper 1, maybe you want to start with that. And the good thing about starting with your favorite topic is it gives you the confidence going forward. So if you can really do well in your first question, you're really, really confident for the rest of the paper, and that makes a huge difference. Or some people might just want to answer the questions in the order that they come up in the exam paper. So maybe for section A, you've decided that you're going to answer question 1, question 2, question 5, and question 6, for example. Maybe you just want to answer them in that order, question 1, followed by 2, followed by 5, followed by 6. It is completely up to you whether you go with starting with your first question or your favorite question, or answering them in the order that they come up. Make sure you're keeping track of your time So make sure that you're not spending too long on one question and then you're short time for another question. So it's important that you have a watch with you in the exam, and there'll also be a clock on the wall, but make sure that you're keeping an eye on your time. So if the exam starts at 9:30 in the morning, then by 9:40, so that's the first 10 minutes have passed, by 9:40 you should be starting your first question in section A. Okay, after giving yourself 10 minutes to start or to read over and choose your questions. And make sure that you get started in good time. So like I said, at 9:40, if the exam started at 9:30, you should be straight into the maths in the exam. Make sure you stay on track. So remind yourself of your timing strategy, and that's exactly what we're going to do now. As I mentioned, you have 10 minutes to read over the paper and choose your questions. In section A, there are 4 short questions, each worth 30 marks, giving me a total of 120 marks. So that gives me 18 minutes per section A question, 18 minutes for each of the short questions. And that leaves me with 30 minutes for each of my section B questions. So that's a total of 1 hour on the section B questions, 2 questions times 30 minutes. That leaves us with a safety net of 8 minutes at the very end of the paper. And that's basically for us to look back over our paper, check all of our calculations, verify everything, and correct any mistakes that we may have made. This timing schedule obviously is assuming that you don't decide to answer any spare questions. And by spare questions, I mean maybe going into the exam, you've decided that you're going to try answer 5 short questions in section A or maybe 3 questions in section B instead of 2. And remember that if you are attempting to do these so-called spare questions, you need to rethink your timings. Okay, so you will not have time to give 18 minutes per section A question if you decide to do more than 4, and you will not have time to give 30 minutes per section B question if you decide to do more than 2 questions in section B. Okay. Again, just to reiterate what I've said already, don't rush. Okay, spend that time wisely, and these timings that we're recommending, that's giving you plenty of time in the exam for each question. Don't get bogged down in a question. So it's very, very easy to get stuck on a question and to stay trying to work it out. But if you're getting stuck at a question and you can't seem to figure it out and the time is up for that question that you've allocated for that question, move on, and we can always come back to it at the end when maybe something is a little bit fresher in our head. Never ever leave a blank answer or leave a part of a question blank. And this is a pet hate of mine. It's something that you should never do because you don't get any marks for leaving something blank. We're all familiar with the attempt marks for a question. So write something down, and the examiner is trying their best to give you marks where they can, but they cannot give you marks if you leave a blank in the exam. So write something down, and remember, in maths we have the beauty of attempt marks. So even if we don't get every single part of every single question fully correct, we can still do pretty well in that question because of these attempt marks for showing our work. You should never be leaving the exam early. If you stick to our timings per question that we've recommended earlier, that leaves you with 8 minutes at the end, and use that 8 minutes wisely. Okay, there's no reason that you should be leaving early in an exam. Okay, and finally here, a brief post-mortem. So when you leave the exam at the end, you can have a brief chat about how the exam went with your friends, but don't spend too long analysing it and agonising over it. For paper 1, so after paper 1, if you're a Leaving Cert student, you might look at how your exam management went, how your timings went, and see is there anything that you could improve on for paper 2 or even for some different subject. But like I said, don't overanalyze it. The paper is done now, leave it behind you and move on to the next exam. As regards your junior cycle then, so junior cycle students, you will have 5 minutes at the start to read through your paper, so to look through the paper and to jot down any notes that might be just fresh in your head and you need to get them down on paper. You don't have any choice in the junior cycle exam, so it's one paper, normally 13 or 14 questions if we're judging by previous and sample papers. You must answer all of the questions. And again, you might like to start with something that is your favorite topic. So maybe you've noticed that a trigonometry question has come up and you love trigonometry. So you might want to start with that question, and that will give you confidence going forward. If you start with your best question and if you do really well on it, that will give you confidence for the rest of the paper. Or you might just decide you're going to start at question 1 and work your way chronologically through the rest of the paper. Make sure you track your time and get started after that 5 minutes at the start is up. Get straight into it. So with the junior cycle, you've the beauty of the suggested timings at the top of the question. So make sure you're trying your best to stick to those. Your timing strategy, as I mentioned, 5 minutes to read the paper. Then base your time on the suggested timings on the top of each question. And if you stick to that, you will have 5 minutes at the end to go back over your paper to correct any mistakes that you will inevitably have made. So go back over and you'll be surprised what things you notice at the end once you've gone through the whole paper. Don't rush. Okay, so take your time. Those suggested timings at the end give you ample time to get through the paper. Don't get bogged down in a question. So if you're struggling with one particular question and the time is almost up, move on to the next question, because getting bogged down in a question, that's just going to make you a little bit anxious. That's just going to stress you out a little bit. Just move on, leave it, move on, and you'll have time to come back to it. Never ever leave a blank. Okay, so again, you will not get any marks for blanks, whereas attempt marks are super in maths because you might get some part of the question right. Yes, you mightn't get it all right, but we have attempt marks there for showing your work and for attempting or getting to some part towards, I suppose, some way towards the final right answer at the end. You should never be leaving early. Again, if you stick to the suggested timings at the top of the questions, this leaves you with your 5 minutes at the end to go back and to use that 5 minutes wisely to verify all of your calculations. Okay, and finally here, a brief post-mortem. So when you leave the exam at the end, you can have a brief chat about how the exam went with your friends, but don't spend too long analysing it and agonising over it. Okay guys, so thank you for tuning in to part 3 of our 4-part webinar series on exam technique. As I mentioned, next week we will be looking at trying to avoid making mistakes in the exam, the best way to avoid making mistakes in the exam. So, and as I also mentioned, you have access to our free exam technique booklet there on the TheMathsTutor.ie website. So hopefully you found that useful, and thanks for tuning in.